Welcome to Global View. Today we have the pleasure to host Peter Schweizer, a renewed investigative journalist and author known for his work in exposing political corruption and influence peddling in the United States and abroad. He's the president of the Government Accountability Institute and he has written several best-selling books, including Clinton Clash, Secret Empires, and Red-Handed: How American Elites Get Rich Helping China Win. His investigative investigations often focus on how powerful political figures and their families use their influence to amass wealth. In Secret Empires, in particular, he uncovered how U.S. politicians, in particular Joe Biden's crime family, profited from foreign business deals in Ukraine and in China. Your latest book, Blood Money, Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills American, discusses the influence of Chinese money on American elites and institutions. You also worked as a consultant for the White House Office of Presidential Speechwriting and have collaborated in documentaries such as The Creepy Line, which examines alleged censorship by tech companies. Welcome to the show. It's an honor to have you here today, Peter.
Hey, it's great to be with you guys. Thanks so much for having me.
Peter, I have personally worked extensively in Ukraine, interviewing key figures such as former President Viktor Yushchenko, even prior the conflict escalated. Most recently, I carried an investigation on Burisma and the corruption of Biden's family in Ukraine. I interviewed key witnesses who suffered prosecution as a result of exposing corruption on the Biden side and at international and national level, in particular Rudy Giuliani, who was actually targeted for simply carrying this investigation on the financial dealings of the Bidens in this infamous company, Burisma. Now, I had the pleasure of reading your book, Secret Empire, and you actually outed many evidence of those financial dealings and this corruption that have been downplayed by the mainstream media. Now, I have two questions to start. First and foremost, why do you believe despite the overwhelming evidence, all these dealings have been so overwhelmingly dismissed by even the mainstream media on the right side, I would say, not only on the left side, and how, to which extent those financial dealings of the Bidens in Ukraine had an influence on his decision about Ukraine?
I think that's a great question. And I think that a lot of foreign governments, particularly those that have corrupt political cultures, feel like the way in which they can bind themselves to the United States is through relationships with powerful political families. In other words, by enriching those families. So I think in the case of Ukraine, you go back to 2014 when Putin moves into Ukraine. There's this immediate rising in the West to this declaration of we're going to resist it and we're going to combat it. One of the first things that is done by Ukrainian oligarchs is they sign up a consulting deal, as it is with Hunter Biden. They make him a director of Burisma. They also make his business partner a director of Burisma, and they start paying him $1 million a year. And obviously, as has been discussed many times, he had no background in natural gas, energy systems, Ukraine, regulatory environment, none of that. It was purely a play in order to wed the Bidens personally to the government in Ukraine. And all you have to do is look at the timing. February of 2014, the military action takes place. Joe Biden is made the point person by Barack Obama on U.S. policy towards Ukraine. And within 3 weeks, Hunter Biden suddenly becomes this director of Burisma. So that absolutely is part of the business model, as it were. And what also happens is then these corrupt elites are looking for benefits from the U.S. government. And this is where mechanisms like USAID and other U.S. government agencies can now start doing favorable things for these corrupt foreign oligarchs who are paying the family members of American politicians. So it's money that almost sort of cycles around, and it's highly corrupt. And that's why I think what you're seeing with Doge, particularly the focus on USAID, is so helpful and important to realize that much of U.S. aid money is really for corrupt purposes. Are there programs that are designed to feed poor people and help them develop? Yeah, there are some. But most of them are slush funds for political leaders. We saw that with the Clintons in Haiti, and we certainly saw that with the Bidens as it relates to Ukraine.
Thank you.
Peter, obviously the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine are in the headlines right now. President Trump made this a major campaign promise to bring an end to this war. We've seen Zelenskyy clash with the president in this infamous Oval Office meeting. We've had Secretary of State Rubio meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. So it looks like there's really some type of momentum, whether Zelenskyy wants this to happen or not, towards some sort of agreement. So the question I have is, based on your research going back into 2014, about these type of payments from the Biden family, from Ukrainian oligarchs and some of the most unsavory players in Ukraine, did that have an impetus to actually start the war or actually allow Putin to move in to Ukraine? And also, that's the first question. The second question is Zelenskyy covering up Biden at this point, now that President Trump is in office?
Yeah, I think Zelenskyy is probably covering up for Biden. Biden was very good for Zelenskyy, and in a way that was kind of an open checkbook. Look, you can make a case, and I would certainly make the case that we should help Ukraine defend itself, but it's how you do that and to what end. And what Trump has come in and done, I think very wisely, has said, look, this has been catastrophic. It's been catastrophic for Ukraine. It's been catastrophic for Russia. If you believe some of the numbers that are coming out, that the Russian casualties are maybe 800,000, that would be the equivalent in the United States of almost 2 million casualties. That is devastating on Russia. It's devastating on Ukraine. So you want to try to negotiate a peace. Of course, the devil's going to be in the details. But the bottom line is that I think what Trump is doing is important. It's going to bring peace to that region. I also think it's part of this broader strategy that I see developing with Donald Trump, who sees and recognizes, I think rightfully so, that the main threat to American interests is China. That China is really the main threat. Do we have our disagreements with Russia? Yes. Are there things that Russia are doing that we don't want Russia doing? Yes. Do we need to raise those issues? Yes, we do. But Russia is not an existential threat to the United States the way that China is. And the posture that the Biden administration in Western Europe has adopted towards Russia has effectively pushed Russia into the camp of being closer to China than I think historically that they would want to be. Russia feeling that they don't have another choice. And this has made them dependent upon China. It's been to the strategic advantage of China. So if you can effectively break this relationship between China and Russia by brokering a peace deal, by bringing Russia back within the community of nations or whatever you want to call it, that I think would be a bold strategic victory by Donald Trump. There's a lot of things that have to happen till we get there. But one of the things that has to happen is that Zelenskyy has to realize that we need to have a peace agreement. Yes, it needs to be just. What that means, of course, is open to debate, but you have to have a deal that both sides are happy with. And I think Donald Trump is somebody that can move us in that direction. Neither side's going to get everything they want, but if we can get peace, if we can create a circumstance where we can have warmer relations with Russia, and so can Europe, that is going to be at the detriment of China, which represents the biggest threat to the United States by far. So I think it's a genius move on the global strategic level.
Peter, thanks for making the point that the deals extend also to China. Actually, the details are also financial dealings with China in your Secret Empire book, and I invite people to read it because the evidence of Biden's corruption are overwhelming. And not only you reported it, I reported it. There are thousands, even like intelligence agents were covering up for them while dismissing the Hunter laptop as Russia propaganda, not because of the images, disturbing images we found in there, but for the evidence of those dealings we could see in these emails. So my next question is, Biden, before leaving office, pardoned himself and his family. This was a preventive pardon, which to me was an admission of guilt because he knows about those evidence. But don't you believe that inaccountability in this case set a sort of a precedent where political figures are some sort of normalized into peddling their influence for financial gain?
Yeah, no, I think that that is the problem. And what I've told people and believe wholeheartedly is that even though Joe Biden is no longer in office, you can't just simply say, okay, well, he's gone, he's done, let's move on. The issue is larger than Joe Biden, because, you know, you guys are students of history. I'm a student of history. And the point is that if you allow corruption to be tolerated, it's going to be imitated. What the Bidens did is not unique to the Bidens. There are plenty of people in Washington, D.C., I would dare say in both political parties, who would love to have an arrangement where, you know, foreign entities in China are giving tens of millions of dollars to your family, enriching them, and to be able to get away with it. So we owe it to ourselves as a country to make sure that justice get done. I'm not an attorney, but I know a number of attorneys that have looked into this area and believe that there are absolutely criminal cases that can be made. So you are quite right. The pardons to me are an admission of guilt. And all you have to do is look at the dates of the period that the pardons cover. The pardon specifically says any possible crimes that would have been committed after January of 2014 up until December of 2024. So January of 2014, what happened beginning in January of 2014? The China deal started in January of 2014. The Ukraine deal happened in April of 2014. You have the $3.5 million he got from Yelena Baturina. That happened in the spring of 2014. So all of those corrupt foreign deals happened during that time period. And the fact that Joe Biden not only pardoned his son, but pardoned his family members who appear on the names of the LLCs through which foreign money flowed is clear indication that they know exactly where their vulnerabilities lie. So I'm a big believer that this is not just about Joe Biden. It's about a larger issue. As I wrote about in Red Handed, it's not just Joe Biden. You've got people like Mitch McConnell and his wife and others that I would argue have very clear vulnerability to manipulation by China and have been manipulated by China because of these financial ties. And we have to decide if we want to live in a country where our elected leaders are allowed to do that. You know, it may not be an issue right now with Donald Trump in the White House, but we don't know what's going to happen in 2028, 2029. We don't know what's going to happen among our senators and congressmen. And the Chinese strategy is one called elite capture, which is pretty brilliant. And it basically says, rather than trying to go toe-to-toe with the United States military, we're just going to buy off parts of their political leadership. And if we buy off parts of their political leadership, we will be able to advance our interests. And I think if you look at the last 20 to 30 years, it's worked pretty well for them.
Peter, on this topic, what are the similarities and the differences between the type of return on investment that China and Ukraine wanted on the Bidens and some of these high-profile people? Because the way I see it is that Ukraine's return on investment is a catastrophic war and the loss of sovereignty and no NATO membership likely, and basically having an East and West divided country, while China continues to grow at a very accelerated pace. Its military is very strong. And the situation with the tariffs is just now being implemented once Donald Trump ascended to the Oval Office. So what return on investment did both China and Ukraine get? And do you see any similarities or differences between how both of these corrupt countries or their officials work to that regard?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think with Ukraine, it's probably easier to discern because it's more clear what the Biden posture was towards Ukraine, and who he tended to favor and not favor internally in Ukraine. So that's pretty clear. In the case of China, there's certainly a lot of things that Joe Biden did as president that were pro-CCP, pro-Beijing. But I have a feeling there are a lot of things that happen behind the scenes that we're not aware of. And so the problem is we don't know. So one of the things that I, in my conversation with Congressman Comer, the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, is there needs to be a damage assessment done. And I would say let's do that for, any of the countries the Bidens were involved in. I mean, generally the three biggest ones are China, Russia, and Ukraine, but potentially looking at the others. What precisely happened? Did Hunter Biden have an influence in these policies? If so, how? What role did the money play? What role did the ability for these foreign oligarchs to whisper in the ears of Joe Biden or of his family? How did that shape American foreign policy? We don't know the answer to it. What we do know, George, I mean, you've done international business, you know how this works. Chinese businessmen are not going to give some $31 million to the Biden family and not get anything in return. They clearly got stuff because $5 million was sent. Some time passed. Then another $5 million was sent. The point was they kept sending money. They were getting something in return. And we know that what China wants strategically is they want basically unfettered access to our, domestic market, which they got with Joe Biden. They want generally unfettered access to our technology, which they generally got with Joe Biden. And they want unfettered access to our capital markets, which they also basically got with Joe Biden. So all of those things, on the most important things, they got from China. Now, in this strategy of elite capture, of which I think the Bidens are exhibit A, the Chinese are very sophisticated. And in the writing that they've done on this amongst themselves, there's this concept of big help with little bad mouth. That's the sort of translation of the phrase. And what it means is essentially they realize for political viability purposes that, an American politician or an Australian politician that they pay off can't say, China's a great country and has no human rights problems. They realize that for political viability purposes, you have to criticize them for the Uyghurs, maybe for human rights. Maybe you have to make noises about Taiwan from time to time. So the fact that Joe Biden did some of that is largely irrelevant. They expect that and realize that for viability purposes, it's important for American politicians to do that. What matters to them are in these big, important areas that I just talked about. And there's just absolutely no question Joe Biden gave them pretty much everything they wanted in those areas. And now with Trump in the White House, we are seeing the opposite. We are seeing them being challenged in all those areas. And I think it's, going to be very exciting to see how things play out. I'm quite optimistic that Trump's strategy in this area is going to work quite well.
Peter, you mentioned the damage assessment or an audit of the potential criminal acts by people like Congressman Comer. Congressman Comer was actually very vocal about presenting receipts, particularly regarding the Biden payments from countries like Romania, even China, Ukraine. But then that all dissipated, that all evaporated into thin air. So the first question is, why did that dissipate? Why did Comer not follow through with it? And secondly, do you expect people like Jamie Comer and others to now continue litigating these facts and investigating these facts now that Donald Trump is in office?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the Oversight Committee did a great job of doing what they could do, right? They have subpoena power, so they can subpoena people, they can subpoena records, and they really did actually get, as you said, the receipts that showed the flow of money. He's always said they don't think they got all the flow of money, that there probably are overseas accounts and things that are beyond the purview of U.S. subpoena. But the big hindrance for him was the Department of Justice that were handed this information. In other words, these are the law enforcement entity that is supposed to investigate and prosecute violations of the law. That's not something the Oversight Committee can do. That ended. Now, what Comer did when Pam Bondi became Attorney General is he sent her, I think, a 7 or 8 page letter saying, here is a list of items that we believe laws that the Biden family violated that we think you should look into prosecuting. So that is with Pam Bondi. I hope that Bondi is going to look at this in the way that it should have looked at in the beginning, which is weigh the evidence and go where the law says it's going to go. My concern is that there are going to be people that say, well, he's no longer in office in the name of national unity. Let's just move on. And again, as I said earlier, to me, that's a big mistake because this is bigger than the Bidens. It's about not allowing the precedent to be established that you can take money from oligarchs in Ukraine or from intelligence connected people in China or elsewhere and get away with it. And that's really the bottom line. So where it stands right now is the Oversight Committee under Comer can potentially call members of the Biden family who have been pardoned back to testify. And I think there's some value in that. But the buck really stops with the Department of Justice. And I hope that they look at considering, where it's appropriate, legal action based on the evidence. And I think we'll know more on that in the next couple of months.
Thank you so much. Besides this judicial inaccountability, we also have experienced this media coverage that was dismissing all those allegations. At least I encountered personally a lot of resistance for the mainstream media and covering everything I reported, even documentaries that are available on Prime Video right now. The mainstream media wouldn't dare talking about that. Did you face similar resistance in your work? Or why do you believe all the media that were overwhelmingly trying to dismiss this narrative, and how this had impacted perception and accountability, also moral accountability in people's eyes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think this, for me, is one of the biggest areas of disappointment because when I started my organization, the Government Accountability Institute, back in 2011, our first projects were working with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 60 Minutes. I mean, we had front page stories in both of those papers. We did a couple of segments with 60 Minutes because we would simply present the evidence. We would go to the news organizations and say, hey, here are the facts. Here's the information. No anonymous sources. Check it out yourself. Exactly. And the evidence always checked out. That completely changed with Trump's rise in American politics. My book, Clinton Cash, was the last one where the mainstream media would simply just look at the information objectively and say, yeah, it's true. We need to run this story. Since that time, as it regards Ukraine, as it regards China, the mainstream media went into the mode of protecting the Bidens because in their mind, I think it's fantasy land, Donald Trump was this existential threat to American democracy. And if we report even honestly on his political opponents, we are somehow aiding and abetting in the destruction of America, which is a ridiculous manipulation that they engaged in. And they still have never given an account for their outright lying. I mean, not just about, George, what you faced, but the Russia collusion narrative in general. Never gave an accounting for that. So it's been a big disappointment to me because all of those news organizations that we had given information to, that they had checked out and had run before, now suddenly we give them the same level of information and they're not interested in touching it. I think by doing so, they certainly affected the 2020 election. But I also think in terms of the long-term institutional viability of mainstream media, they've effectively destroyed it. They cannot go back from this point and pretend that it didn't happen and pretend that they are, balanced in their coverage. So they've done severe damage to their brands. And the problem, I think we would all agree, we would benefit from having sort of just fact-based large media outlets that had resources to cover stories and have reporters everywhere. We don't have that. We're not going to have that. The veil has been ripped off. And I think it's damaging to the country, but the media did it to themselves. They absolutely did it to themselves. And, I have to say the persistence of some of the reporters out there, the persistence of Trump himself to continue to fight on these issues, on the facts and information, has really changed the flow of information in our country, I think, in a positive way. We're no longer dependent upon the authority of a couple of news outlets. I'm old enough, you guys are younger than I am. I'm old enough to remember when, if there was something on the front page of the New York Times, everybody paid attention. Everybody thought, oh my gosh, this person's going down or this is going to happen. New York Times runs things on the front page now. Nobody even pays attention anymore. They did that to themselves because they wrecked their credibility, and people just don't have the confidence that they would have had 40 years ago, that the New York Times is doing a straight story. So that's a healthy, positive development. And what we found, as I'm sure you found, is that alternative sources of information, whether that's cable news, podcasts, social media like X, allows you to reach an audience and expose things. You don't need those gatekeepers anymore. And I think that's also very healthy.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, Peter. About credibility, totally agree with your assessment of the mainstream media, legacy media. I want to shift it to the intel agencies' reputation now and about the 2020 election. During the meeting with Zelenskyy, President Trump mentioned the infamous laptop from hell and how that story was suppressed, willfully suppressed, I might add, by the intelligence community. So why did these 51 intelligence officers basically fall on the sword of this suppression of this particular laptop and the contents within it? Does this directly link into any of your investigations that you uncovered about what Biden was up to in Ukraine? And if so, did the intelligence community have a role in covering it all up? And that's why they decided to fall on this sword and to destroy their reputation and to affect the 2020 election?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can answer that in part. Part of it's going to be speculation on my part. My colleague, Seamus Bruner, wrote a book a few years ago on corruption at the FBI and in the intelligence communities. And one of the things he showed was this revolving door between senior intelligence and law enforcement officials like FBI Director Jim Comey and Mueller, this revolving door between these government agencies and private defense contractors and consultancies. And the fact of the matter is the sort of old military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about applies as much to the intelligence community as it does to the Pentagon and the military. And so the problem is you have groupthink, which happens in any institution, but you also have powerful financial incentives that exists. And when you have two political candidates, set aside the R and the D after their name, you have two political candidates, one of them who believes that the intelligence apparatus is ineffective, corrupt, bloated, and needs reform and change. And you have another one who has been in the United States Senate for 40 years, has been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades, and has never had a problem with that apparatus at all. Which one are you going to line up behind? You know, yeah. we tend to, I think, not so much us, but I'd say we generally, the American public, tend to look at when a former FBI director or a former assistant director or whatever goes on cable news and expounds on an opinion. They are sort of a disinterested party. They are kind of like a detached college professor who's just trying to, maybe some of them are, a lot of them have consultancies. They're being paid by people, either in an advisory capacity, a consultant capacity, or they have equity in these firms. So I think that was what was happening in the background. And I think that the laptop was an opportunity where they felt like we can appeal to our authority, even if it is misplaced, even if it is wrong, even if we are lying through our teeth, we can appeal to our authority. It's happening in October. We'll get past the election and worry about the fallout later. I think that was the calculation. What I would say again is I think it did absolutely affect the 2020 election. And there's a lot of surveys and polls that show that. And that, you know, was, I think, terrible for the country based on what Biden ended up doing as president. But it also further exposed the corrupt nature of the intelligence apparatus, or at least those at the top of the intelligence apparatus. And the credibility of the people that signed that letter outside of the bubble in which they live has been completely destroyed. So, you know, my question to those people is, at what cost? At what cost did you accomplish your political goal? You've destroyed your credibility. You have damaged the institutions that you claimed you were trying to protect because it exposed the political nature of what you were doing and what you're all about. So I'm very excited about, you know, what Kash Patel has talked about doing. My hope is that he gets, and I think he's doing this, gets some, former experienced senior FBI officials who are not part of that system, who see the need for reform, and some of them have been very vocal, so they can help him know where the bodies are buried, explain, here's how we're going to fight this trench warfare, because it is going to be trench warfare. But that's one of the important things that is coming about. And I would argue if those 50 intelligence officers, FBI, hadn't done that, finding the motive for that reform would have been a whole lot more difficult. So again, be careful what you wish for, because I think what those intelligence officials did is they brought it upon themselves, and that's something that's very healthy for us.
Peter, final question for me on this topic, and about just trying to analyze this in the context of 2014 to the present, and try to prevent this type of illegal activity from a sitting president from ever happening again. It seems to me that the moment payments began in 2014 to the Biden family, certain elements of Ukraine became much more aggressive towards Russia, did not want a peace agreement. You had the collapse of the Minsk agreements. You had attacks in the eastern part of Ukraine, the seizure of Crimea. In your research and your investigations, did you see a direct link between money payments to Biden and this aggressive posture towards Russia, and ultimately the invasion of Ukraine based on that activity? Or do you just see it as basically isolated events?
No, I don't think they're isolated. I think you're right that there's a connection there. How direct it is, I don't know. I do think that these corrupt payments to the Bidens, and by the way, there were payments to others as well in Europe, right? I mean, Burisma, they got a former Polish president, they got a former German, I think it was foreign minister. They were paying a lot of people. It was not just the Bidens. I do think that it gave a certain element in Ukraine, two things: a heightened sense of moral authority in their minds, and it gave them a heightened sense of confidence in their position. And I think those two things led to a circumstance where they clearly overstepped. In my view, what you have to do with Putin is what Trump has done. You have to be strong. So I think the emboldened nature of certain elements in Ukraine, with the perceived and actual weakness of Barack Obama in 2014 and Joe Biden the second time, is a lethal combination. And what you need instead is no corrupt payments from anyone overseas, and you need to be strong, direct, and clear. And that was not given to Putin. At the end of the day, in my mind, Putin is responsible. He made the choice, but there are a lot of things that could have been done differently, in a manner and in a way to where this war was absolutely preventable.
Thanks so much. A last question on my side. When we look at the European Union on the other side of the ocean, we see this following of Biden's America, not United States of Trump, into implementing these insane policies. We know also that the last Maidan revolution in Kiev took place because they staged this pro-European feeling in the negotiation of agreements with the European Union. But the European Union never agreed to have Ukraine within the member states based on that level of corruption. So when people look back at history of Ukraine and the history of Ukraine, even with the European Union, how fake and how misplaced seem all this cheerleading of leaders like Macron today for helping Ukraine.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a really important point, and that is that Ukraine's political culture, if it's wedded to the European Union or it's wedded to NATO, you have a country that has a deeply corrupt political culture. And you can argue whatever historical reasons that may be or may not be for that. The fact of the matter is that you do have that factor, and you have a high degree of corruption within the EU itself. I understand. I remember back in the 1990s, the notion of sort of an economic, a common market among Europeans. I think that is good and healthy. I think when they've tried to turn it into this political vehicle, you get this centrist, statist, bureaucratic beast that is trying to run roughshod over national sovereignty and has this sort of expansionist mentality of let's include further members and further states. What you want instead, I think, is a unified Europe in terms of economic borders and barriers are down. A common market is a good thing, but you want vibrant, independent nation states. And there is a reason that Europe is in decline and has been in decline over the last couple of decades. And it is because it has opted for this sort of centralized form of governance that does not want to believe or accept the nation state and a sense of nationalism and national pride. And it's to the detriment of Europe. I'm mindful and hopeful again that we're going to see some trends in Europe. You see that with the Reform Party in the UK, that at least based on the latest polls is running ahead of the Conservatives and the Labour Party. Certainly there are other countries where you see movements in this direction. And I think that is very, very encouraging because Europe needs that kind of transformative revolution. They need a European Doge and more. Because if they don't get it, they are going to continue to further decline, and they're going to continue to move in this absurd direction that, well, we need to import all these people because nobody in Europe is having kids anymore because nobody has hope for the future. And that is not any way, I think, to try to sustain a nation state or a wonderful cultural and history that Europe has as the cradle of Western civilization.
Couldn't agree more with you. And actually, it's funny how the European Union even pretend to be listened to as a unified interlocutor when they lack a constitution and an army. So I don't think they have much leverage in negotiation. But thank you so much for being with us. Where people can follow you and find your work?
Yes. Well, thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. It was a lot of fun. You can follow my work on X at Peter Schweizer, or you can go to the website for my podcast. It's called The Drill Down, and the website is thedrilldown.com. So appreciate your interest in my work, and I had a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Likewise. It was amazing, and we hope to have you back.